My name's Kerry Carter, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Forest Trends, BBOP, and the Programme Committee for this conference to No Net Loss of Biodiversity and Beyond. I'd like to thank very much our co-hosts, Defra and the Zoological Society of London. We're particularly grateful to ZSL for lending us this magnificent venue for the next 2 days. Thanks to our partners IUCN and WBCSD and the other members of the Programme Committee, who you'll find listed in your conference packs. We're extremely grateful to all our sponsors, particularly the principal sponsors, Bouygues Construction, CDC Biodiversité, Forest Trends, the Dutch Platform for Biodiversity, Ecosystems and the Economy, the Nature Conservancy, UK Department for International Development, WWF and ZSL. And many thanks to all of you for dedicating 2 days to discuss this important topic. It's fantastic to see you all here. In fact, we have at least 32 countries represented in the audience. May I ask you to turn your mobiles off or to silent if you haven't already thought to do that. Finally, I'd like to thank our splendid keynote speakers, some of whom have come from a very long way away to join us. We're extremely grateful to them. And speaking of the keynote speakers, I'd like to start this morning's proceedings by introducing our first speaker, Peter Unwin. Peter is Director General, Policy Delivery Group at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs here in the UK. And I believe it was Peter's group at Defra that led the development of the Natural Environment White Paper with its commitment that England will move from net biodiversity loss to net gain. So he's a very fitting person to open the conference. Peter, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kerry, and good morning, everybody. And can I welcome you all on behalf of the UK government to this very important conference, which we in Defra are delighted to co-host. I'm sure I speak for everybody when I thank the Business and Biodiversity Offset Programme for organising this event. I'm sure it was quite a challenge, and I think the success is evident simply from the number of people and the number of countries represented in this room and the fact that they had to close registration for the conference so soon after they opened it. So well done to Kerry and her team. And what could be a more fitting location to hold this conference than the world's oldest scientific zoo, whose mission is to promote and achieve the worldwide conservation of animals and their habitats. I hope those of you from outside London will have time to explore this wonderful place over the next 2 or 3 days. I apologise that one thing we haven't organised as well as we might have done is the weather. But governments across the world have recently set themselves some very ambitious biodiversity targets. For example, at Nagoya and Aichi, of course, and here in the European Union in the EU Biodiversity Strategy. And here in the UK, the government has set the challenge of this being the first generation to leave the natural environment in a better state than it inherited. Building on the commitments that we made at Nagoya and drawing on an excellent report by a panel led by Sir John Lawton, we produced in 2011 our first Natural Environment White Paper for 20 years, which Kerry mentioned. And shortly after that, we produced Biodiversity 2020, a bold strategy for managing our biodiversity. It includes provisions to halt net loss to biodiversity in England within the decade and to increase the overall extent of priority habitats by at least 200,000 hectares. I talk about the UK, but of course I know that those of you here from other countries, you and your governments have made similar commitments and have similar objectives. And that's why it's so important, I think, to have events such as this where we can all work together to exchange information, ideas and perspectives. Through cooperation between national and international interest groups, we're much better placed to meet these national and international targets, and only through that do we have a chance of meeting the huge challenges that we face. Two of my department's major priorities are growing the rural economy and improving the environment. And the government firmly believes that these two go very much hand in hand. It's not a case of either or, we need both. Because you can't improve the environment without a successful economy, and our future economic success depends on a healthy environment and the natural capital it provides. And the measurement of natural capital is an area where we are proud of what we are doing here in the UK. We believe we can bring something to the discussion on this over the next 2 days, because understanding natural capital is essential to integrating biodiversity objectives with business practices and with political and economic decision-making. We're working with the Office for National Statistics here in the UK to account for the economic value of our natural capital. And recently they produced some very initial estimates which put this at a staggering £1.6 trillion, and there's still quite a bit more to count on top of that. In 2011, we also set up the Natural Capital Committee, of which Kerry is a member, to explore ways to include this concept in government policy. And we're also just starting a third round of pilots of payment for ecosystem service models, which will put greater financial value on the benefit we get from our natural assets. So in England, we're making good progress on natural capital, and we'll gladly share some of our experience on it and hear some of your views on it over the next couple of days at this conference. On the other side of the coin, one thing we would like to learn about from you is biodiversity offsetting. As many of you will know, we're looking at this very closely in England and whether it would work here. We've looked at examples abroad, and we have established 6 pilots here which are reporting very shortly. We also ran a consultation exercise on the issue a few months ago. And there are many difficult issues to consider and many strong opinions on either side of the debate held out there. For example, how do we ensure that our special habitats like ancient woodland would continue to have the same or hopefully better levels of protection under an offsetting scheme than they do at the moment? Many of you here today have a lot of experience from either government or industry or NGOs and different perspectives on offsetting, which we are particularly keen to hear and discuss in this afternoon's session on the future of offsets in England. I'm sure this will help us to make informed decisions on the possibility of introducing a scheme here. So we all bring to this conference our own ideas, experience and perspectives and our own questions. Those of us here from the UK government will certainly be participating and following the discussions very closely throughout. Our Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Owen Paterson, was very much looking forward to speaking to you tomorrow on this, and he sends his sincere apologies that he's no longer able to do so because of urgent business. He's asked me to pass on to all of you his best wishes for your important deliberations over the next 2 days, and to say that he's looking forward to hearing the conclusions that you reach. So finally, can I too wish all my own best wishes for a successful conference. You have the opportunity to make a real contribution to putting a stop to the net loss of biodiversity here and in the rest of the world. Make the most of it. Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Kerry Carter, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Forest Trends, the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Programme, and the Programme Committee of this conference to No Net Loss of Biodiversity and Beyond. I'd like to thank our co-hosts Defra and the Zoological Society of London. We're particularly grateful to ZSL for lending us this fabulous venue for the next couple of days. Thanks to our partners IUCN and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the other members of the Programme Committee you can see listed in your packs. We're naturally extremely grateful to all of our sponsors and particularly the principal sponsors. And last but not least, many thanks to all of you for making the time to participate in this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Director of BBOP and the Biodiversity Initiative of Forest Trends, I'd like to add some words of welcome and also a little context for this meeting. Why are we here? We're here because pressures on biodiversity are already serious and will inevitably grow. Each one of us relies on healthy, functioning ecosystems for our lives, livelihoods, and sense of well-being, and so too does the stability of the economy. Yet we continue to lose biodiversity through activities such as construction, extraction, and agriculture, and as a growing population consumes more. 27 years after the Brundtland Commission coined the term sustainable development, we continue to search for the practical mechanisms to reconcile development with environmental protection and social fairness. The course of the next 2 days will tell, but I'm willing to bet that pretty much every person here believes that significant acts of political will, innovations in corporate practice, and changes in personal behaviour are crucial to bridge the gap between where we need to be and where our current path is leading us. So we're here to explore whether and how we can ensure no net loss of biodiversity and of course go beyond that to a net gain in government policy, in corporate and financial practice, and as communities, NGOs and researchers. There's some reason for optimism. Some 39 countries now have existing laws and policies on no net loss or a net gain, on biodiversity offsets or on compensation. and 22 countries are developing them. At least 18 multinational companies have made commitments to no net loss or a net positive impact. 78 financial institutions have adopted the Equator Principles that espouse no net loss for impacts on natural habitat and a firm commitment to net gain for impacts on critical habitat. And civil society is beginning to hold governments and developers alike to account for these outcomes. These are powerful drivers, but a more critical analysis reveals a different picture. It's easy to say net gain, but difficult to deliver in practice. It's hard to build agreement between departments of government and within company boards. It's hard to arrange financial transactions so that the steps necessary for no net loss are followed. And it's hard to build trust within society. Where are our shining examples of independently verified, measured and reported success with no net loss? They're very few. Given our limited understanding of the effectiveness of measures to remedy impacts, humility is called for in aiming for no net loss. There's a great deal of public mistrust about tools such as biodiversity offsets. There's suspicion that offsets make it easier to permit developments that harm biodiversity, and that the concept of no net loss is a front to allow inappropriate impacts. People challenge the questionable track record of mitigation and activities that were called offsets in the past. They doubt whether no net loss is theoretically possible, and they question whether we have the political will, the knowledge, and the capacity to deliver in practice. The emphasis often remains on partial damage limitation rather than avoidance on impacts on irreplaceable biodiversity. From the business side, there's concern that the costs of improved mitigation can make no net loss projects uncompetitive, that standards can be prescriptive, and that more flexibility is needed. These are all issues that we should discuss over the coming 2 days. It's against this backdrop that my colleagues and I established BBOP 10 years ago. In fact, this conference marks BBOP's 10th birthday. BBOP is a group of NGOs, civil society and research organisations, governments, companies and financial institutions working together to explore whether and how development can be planned for no net loss outcomes. The members are exploring how to avoid, reduce and finally to offset residual harm from development, sharing experiences of good practice and testing new approaches. BBOP set out to provide proof of concept by engaging business leaders in pilot projects and working with all its members to develop the tools and guidelines needed to underpin best practice. It's become an international multi-stakeholder group and forum fostering a shared vocabulary and know-how. Over years of testing, negotiation among members and public consultation, we developed a set of core principles that are now widely agreed by all the BBOP members and also outside BBOP, and which deliberately embrace the different stakeholders' viewpoints. The BBOP principles and the subsequent standard on biodiversity offsets enable people to design and implement projects to follow the mitigation hierarchy rigorously in order to achieve no net loss and preferably a net gain. The standard allows the assessment of mitigation activities, including independent third-party verification, with a view to making outcomes not only measurable, but also transparent and trustworthy. All BBOP's resources, guidelines and case studies are freely available in the public domain. There are now some 80 members. We're trying to learn from experience around the world, both good and bad, to improve the standard and guidelines, to build capacity and to encourage dialogue and the sharing of best practice through events such as this. Is net gain achievable or an unrealistic dream? By including offsets as the last step in the mitigation hierarchy, are we creating a license to trash? Or are we doing something essential and urgent, finally taking steps to ensure proper rigour in the planning of projects and closing the loop so that loss is no longer free and it becomes more rational and cost-effective to avoid impacts at source rather than to deal with the consequences later? There are certainly risks associated with poor mitigation, failure to avoid impacts, and trying to use offsets for situations where they're simply inappropriate. But ladies and gentlemen, we have to ask ourselves, what's the alternative? What's the counterfactual? What happens if we don't make new efforts to achieve a net gain or at least no net loss? We face what I believe to be a much bigger risk, the continued loss of biodiversity at an unprecedented rate. I believe we can turn the aspiration of no net loss, and often even a net gain, into practical outcomes at a scale that makes a significant contribution to conservation targets. This could generate an order of magnitude more investment in conservation than is available at present through the public purse, delivering a better outcome for biodiversity and for communities than does the status quo, in which most impacts, frankly, are not compensated at all. It can enable local people to have new jobs delivering measurable conservation outcomes, and it can help companies identify and manage their risks. But only if the necessary standards and safeguards are in place and are trusted, and if we continue to talk and work together to build confidence and show more examples of success. In 1746, a British statesman, the Earl of Chesterfield, wrote a letter to his son saying, "Whatever is worth doing at all is worth doing well. Planning for no net loss and a net gain is worth doing, but it must be done well in order to produce results and enjoy support." I hope you have a good time at this conference, use the 2 days to discuss the fundamental questions and help define what's needed to do this well and put us on a path that takes us to no net loss and beyond. Thank you. Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Baillie, who's the Conservation Programmes Director at ZSL. Professor Baillie is responsible for conservation projects here at ZSL, focusing on threatened species and their habitats in more than 50 countries. He has phenomenal research and conservation experience in countries as varied as Gabon, Namibia, and Mongolia, and has overseen the development of a number of the leading biodiversity indicators and co-founded ZSL's Edge of Existence programme. As well as sitting on several boards, Jonathan finds time to work on innovative financial mechanisms such as rhino bonds. And it's been marvellous working with you and your colleagues to organise this meeting. Thank you, Jonathan. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Kerry. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Zoological Society of London. My name is Jonathan Baillie, and as Kerry said, I run the conservation programs all over the world for ZSL. It is a great honor to welcome you to this symposium, looking at no net loss. And I'm sure many of you are aware of some of our work, working with indicators globally. But we work with WWF on the Living Planet Index. And WWF and ZSL pulled together this population time series, which looks at vertebrate populations around the world. And what it tells us is if you look at 1970 to the present, we've seen a 30% decline in abundance. We also work with IUCN. We've done many of the red list assessments. We've contributed to the broader program. And IUCN has shown, if you look across the broad range of taxonomic groups in vertebrates, and plants, very roughly you see about 20% of species threatened with extinction. So if you walk through a forest, you're looking at about 1 in 5 species. And we think that current extinction rates are about 1,000 times that of background extinction rates. So what is this telling us? Well, it's telling us that our current development model isn't working. It's telling us we have to be creative and we have to think about new ways for the future. And that's exactly what this symposium is about. It's about thinking about industry and its impacts on biodiversity and how we can develop a mitigation hierarchy to reduce that impact or actually improve the status of biodiversity. Now, it's no secret that biodiversity offsets are controversial. There was a conference last night on Nature Not for Sale, or yesterday. And it's an issue that really polarizes the conservation community. In terms of ZSL, we've been around since 1826. We're a science-based conservation organization. We have been hosting meetings like this, scientific meetings, symposiums, since our inception. You're in a room which is called the Huxley Theater. Even Darwin and Huxley were talking about evolution. So controversy isn't new to us. What's important to us is that everybody has an opportunity to voice their opinion, that it's heard, and ultimately we follow the scientific evidence, the evidence base. And I understand that there's going to be a number of presentations here looking at the evidence base behind some of the pilot studies of offsets, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing those. But we're very honored to be hosting this conference. We're very honored to be a member of BBOP. And we accept, as an organization, that Society is now just over 7 billion people. By 2050, we're going to go to 9.2 billion people. There is going to be development. There is going to be change. Habitats will be transformed. And we do need a mitigation hierarchy in place that's solid, understood, and everyone's bought into. And we accept that in some cases, it may be appropriate to do offsets. But that would be a very last resort. And I would like to emphasize, from ZSL's point of view, there are many cases where offsets are completely unacceptable. I was recently just at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. There was a film that was launched, it was called Virunga, and it's about Africa's oldest national park. It's about a World Heritage Site. And I'm sure you know this, but World Heritage Sites only represent about 0.8 of the world's land surface. And here we have a British-based company going in and exploring for oil in a World Heritage Site. For this, there are no offsets, and that we must be clear about. And there are many other examples such as this where offsets will just be out of the question. So with this, I'd just like to welcome you. I hope we have an amazing discussion and dialogue. We talk about the mitigation hierarchy, drive forward the discussion, and come out with solutions which are best for biodiversity. And I hope that we are ambitious, and we don't just talk about no net loss, but we talk about net positive gain. So thank you, and I now have to do some hosting responsibilities in terms of housekeeping. We have some fire exits here, so there's one up to your right here and one down here to your left. If in the unlikely case of a fire, we just go through these two doors and convene outside. Please make sure that your mobile phones are off because we are live streamed and online right now, and it will interfere otherwise. If you go through the doors here and up the stairs, you will find the washrooms. In addition to that, we're not just limiting the meeting to this room. It's going to be dynamic in many different places across the organization. We're going to be in the Prince Albert Hall. We're going to be in the beautiful Victorian building, which is the Mappin Terrace, and a number of other places. But we have volunteers that are going to help move you around and guide you to these places. But if you open your packs, you'll also find a map which can guide you to the appropriate place. But with that, welcome, and thank you very much.
Jonathan, thanks again for having us. And you know, I was kind of hoping to hear you say at the end, to get to the Mappin, you turn right at the vultures and left and you head for the kangaroos. But people can find that from looking at their maps. Well, our next speaker, our keynote speaker, is Julia Marton-Lefèvre, Director General of IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Julia was formerly Rector of the University for Peace, the Executive Director of LEAD International, and Executive Director of the International Council for Science. She's had a very distinguished academic career and is the holder of many awards, and still somehow finds the way to serve on many boards, combining this with her leadership role at IUCN. We're really delighted to have had an opportunity to work in partnership with IUCN preparing for this event and to have you here, Julia. Thank you very much for coming, and you're most welcome.
Yeah, find some space. Good morning. First of all, I want to say I think we started on an auspiciously good note by identifying a common problem, agreeing to solve it under the table, and we did solve it. So this is already a good sign for success, I think, and that's exactly what we're about here. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak at such an important event. So before I begin, let me take the opportunity to wish BBOP, I really don't like acronyms, but that's such a nice one, BBOP a happy 10th birthday. IUCN is proud to have been one of the founding members and to have contributed to the development of the BBOP offset principles, which have gained broad acceptance by a wide variety of stakeholders. I know that there is still controversy, but let's try to solve some of those problems. Speaking about birthdays, this is the 50th anniversary of the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, and we'll be celebrating that all over the world, and I should be wearing red today, actually. So as a global membership organization, IUCN is all too aware that activities such as mining and infrastructure development remain central to many countries' economic development and poverty reduction strategies. We know that governments, no matter how well-intentioned, face the dilemma of how to reconcile economic development imperatives with those of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. In a perfect world, such hard choices would not exist. Unfortunately, biodiversity, minerals, and other important commodities have the common habit of sharing the same space in a landscape. For governments, this may appear as a zero-sum game, either sacrificing development or sacrifice conservation, but forget about having them both. So fortunately, thanks to the work of several organizations, including BBOP, an alternative choice now exists in the form of biodiversity offsets. To be clear, and as has been said already, that choice still provokes controversy among many, and certainly among members in the large IUCN network. But it nevertheless holds out a possibility that allows development to work in a more synergistic manner with conservation. Such an approach is consistent with the work of the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, one of IUCN's strongest partners. Biodiversity offsets need to operate within a strong guiding framework. They must be used only as a measure of last resort, following the mitigation hierarchy steps of avoidance, minimization, and rehabilitation. The offset must be like for like, verifiable using well-defined metrics, and permanent. Even then, several open questions remain, such as recognizing the limits to offsetting, and I'm glad that you mentioned Virunga, Jonathan. For example, we feel very strongly that one cannot compensate for losses in World Heritage sites. Those outstanding universal values have been agreed and must be protected. And of course, also, we cannot compensate for species extinction. So of course, ours is a journey of learning that is not yet concluded. We're currently at a point in this journey where the stakes are high. If offsetting gains traction and is translated into corporate, financial, and regulatory policy with unresolved knowledge gaps, it could undermine established approaches to managing biodiversity risk. On the other hand, if progress on biodiversity offsets is stalled by overcautious concerns of what might go wrong, conservation could lose a significant opportunity to transform regulatory standards and industrial footprints. This in turn might damage conservation's credibility with those progressive companies that genuinely want to do the right thing and need partners to help them figure out how to achieve this. I'm particularly glad that Peter Bakker is here representing the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. He'll tell us more about this, but I don't want to embarrass you, Peter, but I just want to say I'm so proud that the WBCSD has recently joined IUCN's membership, and it's great to have this wonderful organization with us. So as a response to these challenges, IUCN members at our last World Conservation Congress in 2012 gave us the mandate to consider the evidence before us and to develop policy recommendations on biodiversity offsets. I remind you that we have 1,242 members, so this was a strong instruction to me as Director General. So this policy will not only act as an authoritative basis for IUCN's future positions, it will undoubtedly serve as a key reference point for how our members approach this issue. So as a first step after this Congress resolution, we established a technical and scientific study group composed of recognized experts from IUCN member organizations and from our expert and technical commissions. I was present at the first meeting of this study group held in Edinburgh last year, and I can vouch for the breadth and depth of the knowledge of the members as well as their commitment. So this group has now finished its work, and its key findings include the following conclusions. Offset systems should aim to achieve at least no net loss and preferably a net gain for all biodiversity. And I really hope we're going to talk about the positive part of this. We also found that the principal reasons that offset failed to achieve no net loss or net gain appear to be a lack of a clear policy framework and insufficient political will to require and enforce best practice in offsetting. This is something that I hope this meeting will make progress on. And by the way, there will be a World Café session later on at this meeting to discuss in much more detail the findings of our study group. So the next step in IUCN's biodiversity offset policy process will be the establishment of a policy working group which will draw from the work of the technical study group to analyze options and then propose an IUCN biodiversity offset policy. And this sounds like a very heavy bureaucracy, but this will happen now very soon. So as with all the work we do, our biodiversity offset work will be carried out in a transparent manner and draw on the expertise and experience of IUCN members, of civil society organizations, governments, and business. We have a rich agenda ahead of us for the next 2 days. A great deal is riding on our ability to find better ways to plan for no net loss and a net gain of biodiversity. I look forward to participating and will take your experiences and recommendations on board as IUCN proceeds with this work. So finally, I hope to see many of you at IUCN's World Parks Congress in Sydney this November. This is something that IUCN organizes once every 10 years only. A key aim of the Congress is to position protected areas firmly within the broader goals of sustainable economic development and community well-being. Our discussions here are very relevant to as inputs to the World Parks Congress, and I really do hope I'll see many of you there. Thank you very much.
Julia, thank you very much indeed for those interesting and exciting words. And thank you for your 2 invitations, one to the World Cafe this evening,
yes,
and then to your 10-year meeting later on this year, where it sounds as though there's going to be much more discussion of this topic. Thank you. Well, our next keynote speaker is Dr. Braulio Diaz, who's the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Before taking up this position with the CBD, Braulio served as the National Secretary for Biodiversity and Forests at the Brazilian Ministry of the Environment. And throughout his career, Braulio has been a champion for biodiversity, whether with the scientific and technical advisory panel of the Global Environment Facility, as Vice President of the International Union for Biological Sciences, or as coordinator of the steering committee of IABN. Braulio, we're honored and delighted that you could join us. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you very much for inviting me to come to this very important meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to address you for this conference. And as you know, the CBD is a major forum to promote public policies, but also to promote a better linkages with the conservation and the development divide, if we may, but of course what we're trying is to encourage much more partnership and a reduction of conflicts between development and conservation. And as was already mentioned, in 2010, we adopted the strategic plan for biodiversity for this decade, which includes 20 global biodiversity targets, which are referred to as the Aichi biodiversity targets. And these targets include not only the more traditional targets to promote conservation and to reduce the threats, the direct threats to biodiversity, but they also include targets to work on the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, and that's in the social and economic sectors, and also targets to enhance the promotion of the benefits to society of biodiversity. And it's very good to see that discussions following the Rio Plus 20 conference outcomes, which are taking place in New York to discuss the post-2015 development agenda and the sustainable development goals, are moving in a good direction. And we're quite pleased to see that biodiversity is being well recognized. And currently, it's in a draft proposal from the co-chairs of the Open Working Group on SDGs to have a standalone goal on ecosystems and biodiversity. but also a goal on oceans. And also biodiversity is being recognized as an important driver to reach other important goals. And I think that's quite important. So we're talking about the role of biodiversity for food security. We're talking about the role of biodiversity to promote and guarantee the access to water, goals related to promotion of health, goals related to promote the eradication of poverty, promotion of human well-being. So you cannot do any of these things if we keep losing biodiversity. Biodiversity is an essential component to promote this. So more and more we're trying to promote that biodiversity is not just a problem because we're losing it. It should be seen as part of solution to promote a real sustainable development policy. But unfortunately, as you all know, we are still losing biodiversity very fast. And unfortunately, all the drivers behind biodiversity loss are still progressing and increasing in many cases all around the world. So unfortunately, the risk of losing biodiversity are still very present. And many of the Aichi biodiversity targets, they relate to the discussions that we're going to see these 2 days here. So for example, Target 2 seeks to integrate the values of biodiversity into development plans and policies, and those policies for poverty eradication. But also parties committed themselves to include the values of biodiversity into national accounting. And we're seeing increased interest in work in that area. And Peter mentioned this. Target 5, for example, seeks to reduce by at least half the current rate of loss of ecosystems, natural habitats, including forests, and wherever possible to reduce that loss to close to zero, and of course also considering the need to reduce degradation and fragmentation. Target 11, of course, we hope to see progress in the increase in the extension and the quality of the management of protected areas. At least 17% in terrestrial and inland waters, and at least 10% in coastal and marine areas. Targets 14 and 15 talk about the need to safeguard ecosystems that are key for the maintenance of ecosystem services and to restore at least 15% of degraded land. So there's quite a number of very key targets there. And of course, these are global targets. The good thing is that parties agreed to internalize these targets into national policies. So what we're seeing now is countries reviewing their national strategies and policies and programs, and to align them to this global framework and to adopt national targets for biodiversity as well. And at the global level, we also see a lot of discussions about the need for reduction in the loss of biodiversity. So people talk about a need for a goal for zero deforestation, for example, or zero net land degradation goal as promoted under the Convention to Combat Desertification, for example. So there are many drives for us to really stop doing business as usual. And of course, this might include a higher cost for society. But that's the cost we have to pay, because otherwise we will lose biodiversity and we will lose exactly what makes it possible for all our societies to live and all our economy to function. So under the CBD, we have been discussing a number of policy instruments that can help promote the biodiversity agenda. And the issue of biodiversity offsetting or compensation is in the agenda. It has been discussed. We still haven't managed to agree on a formal guidance for all the countries on the use of such instrument. There's a broad call from the parties of the CBD asking for more information about the use of these tools, about technical, scientific discussions about the plus and minus of using these tools. There is a good opportunity for the CBD to be able to help fill this gap of insufficiency in terms of public policies to promote our way forward. Of course, there are concerns, and very legitimate concerns, from civil society, from the academy, from indigenous and local communities about potential misuse of an instrument as biodiversity offsetting. And biodiversity offsetting cannot be taken as a license to do anything we want and just continue business as usual. So we have to really develop this to high standards and appropriate procedures to guide everyone on the use of such tool. This is especially important in developing countries because developing countries' population is still growing very fast, and the need to promote enhancement of infrastructure, for example, enhanced production of energy, is very present. So we cannot ignore this, and we need to find ways to deal with conflicts of interest between development initiatives and conservation. And of course, a key element is information. So we need better information from science about the geographic distribution of biodiversity, where biodiversity is. Because we cannot accept offsetting, or we cannot accept projects that would imply the elimination of irreplaceable components of biodiversity. We cannot agree that a project would go ahead if we know that it would mean the extinction of a species. One of the problems, of course, is that differently from this country here, in many other countries, especially in the tropics, we still know just a fraction of our biodiversity. In my country, in Brazil, the estimate is that we only know about 10%. So we have to implement things with the precautionary principle or precautionary approach. And most of the new species being discovered in the tropics, of course, they are very localized species, not species with very broad distribution. So the chances of finding species that are unique to a certain place are very big. So we have to deal with this. But making good information, the best information available, really available to everyone, so all the stakeholders to participate in a very democratic discussion about options about development and how to conciliate that with conservation needs. And of course, the problem is that in many places we haven't put in really in place a sufficient network of protected areas. So we have to go hand in hand as we promote development. We have to still also, and very importantly, promote an enhancement of conservation efforts. Then we also have the problem of the rights of indigenous and local communities. And in many parts of the world, unfortunately, their rights are still not well respected. And we have an issue of lack of clarity about land rights in many places. So that is a good ingredient for bad decisions and potentially for land grabbing consequences. So I really look forward to see good discussions from this meeting here, and certainly in the CBD we welcome receiving good advice on how best to promote the implementation of such mechanisms. And we really need to find ways to bridge the gap between conservation and development. Otherwise, just doing business as usual will not be sufficient, and we know that. So I just want to finalize to say that we agree that potentially this instrument can be used to solve situations of conflicts of interest and have a good solution. But ideally, good solutions should be win-win solutions. So it should be good for all the sides around the table. It should not be good just for one side and with bad consequences for the other. So, and of course, nature should be seen as one of these parts in such a discussion. So we need win-win solutions as much as possible. We need to make use of instruments such as this and some other ones to really bridge the gap between the conflicts that are raised between development and conservation. And as I started saying, I think with the discussions that are taking place in New York, we hope that next year the countries will be, the governments will be adopting the new guidance at the global level for sustainable development, and that this should start really changing the way we do business in most governments and in the private sector. And private sector needs to take their responsibility. Conservation is not just a job of governments. It's a job for all of us, all society. And business, as the main users of natural resources, has a key responsibility in implementing and fulfilling its role. So that's what we expect from business. We expect change in the business as usual and be more proactive towards conservation of biodiversity. And that, in the end, should help maintain the enabling environment for business to keep going. Thank you.
Braulio, thank you very much for those reflections and for reminding us that business as usual is not going to work out, and that we are seeking these win-win solutions that bring conservation and development together with issues of social equity as well, and that there is a framework of intergovernmental targets that we can work towards and that no net loss can perhaps contribute to helping achieve. Our final keynote speaker in this session is Peter Bakker, who's the president of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Peter's had a distinguished career in the world of business, including as the CEO of TNT NV, and he's won numerous awards for his contributions to corporate responsibility. Peter, we appreciate you've come all the way from Singapore this morning to join us. Thank you very much. We've appreciated WBCSD's partnership in this meeting, and we're very pleased to see you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Your Excellency, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me give out a health warning. I'm Dutch, which means broken English, but more importantly, very low on diplomatic skills. I'm jet-lagged, and I'm from business. I mean, this could be a killer combination this morning. So I'm very pleased to be here. I have the microphone, you just have your emotions, right? That's, off we go. So I would be stronger than you were. In the eyes of business, at least in the fraction of business that I represent in the World Business Council, business as usual is dead. We're on a trajectory for the planet, we're on a trajectory for societies, which is going to drive us off the cliff. And capitalism is at the heart of the problem that we have. And we need to talk about these things very seriously. So I'm a capitalist. Julia, she once was so kind to invite me to Jeju Island. I've met some of you there on the last World Conservation Congress, and I got to make a plenary speech. And I opened my speech saying, I'm a capitalist, and I bet if the 3,000 people in that room would have had tomatoes handed out on the door, I would have not been standing here. I would have been drowned in tomato soup. So business is aware that there are main challenges ahead of us. It's not that we don't know that sustainability or inequality are main threats to the society that we run. The current generation of business leaders knows that business cannot succeed in a society that fails. We must act. My second piece of health warning, though, is this is my number 7 conference in 7 days in 7 different countries. I've been talking to water, to food and land use, on inclusive capitalism, on cities, and today on no net loss, on biodiversity and beyond. I must admit, Kerry, you're doing wonderful work, but you need to get to your title, because no net loss on biodiversity and beyond for business means absolutely nothing. And it's not even positive, no net loss. Well, let's not kill anyone. Yeah, that's absolutely right. But we need to get better at making the urgency speak to people, not just the people like all of us in this room who know what you're talking about, but people outside of this room. We also must not forget that almost all these sustainability issues are interrelated. You can't talk about climate change without talking about water. You can't talk about water without talking about ecosystems and land use. You can't talk about feeding people without talking about all of the above. We need to talk about holistic solutions. So I'm very, very happy for all of you to be in this room for the next few days and talk about no net loss of biodiversity. But let's not forget to make sure that all we do links into other conversations so we get to systemic solutions. At business, we at this point in time are mainly interested in understanding how do we scale up solutions. We know there's a problem. We have a pretty good grasp on what type of solutions work, but the solutions that are being put in place are too small scale. How do we scale up what we know could work? And for us, there are 3 dimensions of scale that we need to explore. The first one is innovation. We need to innovate, whether it's technology, business models, regulation, all 3 will be required to get scale to work. The second thing is we need to talk about valuation, which is the best business case. And I know, because you just told me, there are conferences, and that was one of the pushbacks I got in Jeju as well. Do not put a price on nature. And I'm perfectly happy to understand where those conversations come from. But in the economic world that we all together have created and live in, is if you do not put a value on something, it will not be valued. And that's the reality of the world. And so we need to talk about what is the business case for no net loss in biodiversity. And again, I would seriously call on you, Julia, on yourself. There is at this point in time a report in the making called the New Climate Economy. It's going to come out probably early September around the Leadership Summit in New York. That's going to change, I'll promise you, that's going to change the conversation around climate change. It's going to, for the first time, show that economic growth is possible and attacking climate change is possible as well. It's not an offset, a trade-off. I would strongly call on the leadership in this room. We should start a similar piece of work on ecosystems and biodiversity. Because today, and this may be my limitation and other people may prove me totally wrong, but today, for me, the link is not clear enough yet. So what have we done in the World Business Council? We've been working with over 800 scientists to design what are the planetary stress points and what are societal stress points. We've taken the planetary boundary framework that science has come up with as our starting point. We've selected 9 priority areas where business, in its sustainability efforts, should focus. 5 natural capital, 3 social capital, and 1 which we call the nexus. The natural capital ones are climate change, ecosystems, water, release of harmful substances, and release of nutrients. The social one are basic needs and rights to do with poverty, our skills and employment, and our sustainable lifestyles. And the nexus is the nexus between food, fuel, fiber, and fresh water. For each of these 9 priority areas, we've set goals. Business is extremely simple, and if you want to work with business, you need to understand this simplicity. You only have to remember 4 words. Plan, do, check, act. Plan, do, check, act. If you sing it a little bit, plan, do, check, act, you can remember it quite easy. So what business needs is a goal, an overarching goal. What is the thing we're planning for? Then business will do something. Business are the people that can do people. They will go. There are 15 or 20 business people in the room. They can explain how this works. You make a budget and then they start to work. Halfway in the year, you measure whether you're on track for your budget. That's the check part. If you're not on track of the budget, you steer and you do something else. Plan, do, check, act. So let's formulate what are the goals we're after, and let's formulate them in a way that they are actionable. That if you want to talk to a business, sometimes individual businesses, or to a sector, which is often more of a scale, or to a supply chain, which you see so powerfully happen in the Tropical Forest Alliance at the moment, then we can get into action and can align the actions with the important conservation goals that are out there. So we've created 9 priority areas, 9 goals. The goal for ecosystem is by 2020, reduce the loss of natural ecosystems and restore degraded ones so that biodiversity and ecosystem services are maintained. And this is language which is completely consistent with the language in the CBD, because I mean, I'm not here to talk about SDGs, I guess, but what the world needs is we need to take the SDGs as the holistic solution for all issues in the world. We need to drive national governmental action plans, and we need to drive business sectorial action plans aligned to the SDGs. The same thing here. If the CBD is the central governmental framework that we, I've seen it, thank you, that we're going to align, let's make sure business aligns with the CBD goals. We need to improve the business case. A big part of that is language. I'm sorry for my limitations in the English language, but biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, I'm now 2 years in the circus of sustainability. I begin to know what people mean but as a business person, it means absolutely nothing to me. If there are no more bees to work in agriculture to make sure that we get cross-pollination and all, hey, wow, that's like a big issue, yeah. What are we going to do about that? And I guess that's biodiversity loss, but the language, we need bridges in the language. A language that is very comfortable for people in business, not so comfortable for everybody in this room is, let's just call it natural capital. Let's just say that capitalism is on the wrong track. And why? Because capitalism only tries to manage returns on financial capital. And that's a fundamental flaw in capitalism, because we also use natural capital, ecosystems, biodiversity. We also use social capital. Why do we not have a return on environmental or natural capital, or a return? And if you degrade land, you have a cost. If you restore land, you have a benefit. And that way, I don't think it will be cost negative, because if we're able to make it no net loss, then it will actually be a zero-sum game. So this is the way forward. For that, we need to create standards. So the Natural Capital Coalition, also formed here in the UK, with the accounting and the amazing work that the Prince of Wales is doing in your country. The Natural Capital Coalition is now working on the Natural Capital Protocol. Lots of different people are coming together there and trying to create how should business measure its impact and its dependency on ecosystems. What is the measurement? How do we measure? Which tools do we use? And eventually, and I want that to happen 5 years from now, but everybody tells me I'm a bit too impatient. 10 years from now, that will become the accounting rules on how business will deal with these issues. And it's very simple in business. If a business person talks about its revenue, nobody ever asks, Mr. Businessman, how have you calculated revenue? What was the formula you used? And why is that? Because there's an accounting rule. If you ask an average business person, what is your impact on biodiversity loss? He will just give you probably a blank stare at best, or an incomparable answer to other answers a little bit better. So we need to work hard to get towards a common framework for how to measure and management. If we can get there, and please, you know, I don't want to open the Pandora box of do we or do we not value nature, but it's not about ownership of nature, it's putting a value so that we get to better decisions. That's what we need to figure out. And if we can figure that one out, And if the community in this room can help us create goals that people in business can relate to, then you will see that business becomes an engine for solutions, a force for good. Because it's very simple. 10 days ago, a good friend of mine passed away. He was the first Dutch astronaut. He died from an illness. He wrote a letter. It was actually in English, you may have seen it. And it happens to all astronauts. Everybody who's been in space looks down on the planet, sees this little blue ball. It's beautiful, it's blue, there are no borders, there is no England or Germany or Brazil or any other country. It's land and it's sea. It's a beautiful blue ball in absolutely nothing, and the spaceship is in trouble. We are all astronauts. We are all in this together. We need to fix it together, so I'm here to hope that that will work. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much for that call to arms and reminding us that we need to set very clear and appropriate targets that speak to business and engage them. And thank you also for challenging us on the rather wordy title of the conference. I agree that it's a bit of a mouthful, and I like very much your comments on natural capital and thinking of the broad membership of WBCSD and some clear targets. How fantastic it would be if the CEOs of a number of the WBCSD members were able to make commitments to no net loss of natural capital or biodiversity, and maybe we can craft together some specific words that speak to your members and provide a suitable rallying cry. Thank you very much indeed for your remarks. That brings this initial session to a close. What I'd like to do is to introduce my colleague, my boss, Michael Jenkins, the President of Forest Trends. He's going to take over and chair the next session.